Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to continue building our Atlantic world by talking about the trade empires of West Africa. This is one of the areas that we often don't do a very good job of teaching about and don't know a lot about. So I'm just going to try to give a quick overview of the West African trading empires as they were established and setting the stage for the beginning of transatlantic trade. So here are our objectives for today, and let's dive into our narrative. So the Saharan Trade, the Pan-Saharan Trade Network is one of the really overlooked trade networks in world history. Just about everyone's heard of the Silk Road, but very few people know about the trade networks, or it seems like we don't really focus on the trade networks crossing the Sahara Desert. Africa has a really complicated and difficult geography that separates it out into a variety of different regions, and because we don't study Africa very well, people just sort of deal with it monolithically and try to make assumptions about all Africans, which is really problematic because there's huge differences between the strongly Muslim influenced parts of sort of North and East Africa, and sort of the southwest African trading empires, and then of course the Bantu peoples that spread across the southern part of Africa, south of sort of the Congo River Basin. And so it would take an entire class to get into all these groups. So let's just say that Saharan trade is relatively difficult because, as you can see here, the Sahara Desert is a very large, difficult to cross desert. But sub-Saharan Africa is an incredibly rich part of the world, filled with all sorts of valuable crops, valuable minerals, diamonds, gold, oil, all these sort of things. And so Africa is a spectacularly rich continent, and African kingdoms have built and maintained huge stores of wealth by harvesting and then trading these incredibly valuable components. And so the first of these African trade empires is the Empire of Ghana, established around its capital of Kumbi-Sele. They became incredibly wealthy through developing, again, trade networks across the Sahara, trading silk and gold and a variety of different crops and things like that. And they used this in order to build a relatively large, complex empire. Over time, the Kingdom of Ghana was converted to Islam, mostly because in the years after the Muslim conquest, it was predominantly Muslim merchants who were crossing the Sahara Desert, and emissaries from Ghana, when they would cross the Sahara on the other side, would encounter the Muslim North African world. And so, because of this, they imported advanced technology from these Muslim societies. They generally brought in Arabic as a written language. The large standing armies were similar to what was happening in Muslim Arab states at this time, and they would also develop sculpture in the sort of Muslim style. Generally, in these sort of sub-Saharan African societies, women had relatively high status, at least compared to women in the rest of the world. And so we're going to see this as we go through sort of sub-Saharan African history, the importance of women within these societies and these groups. The Kingdom of Ghana was replaced by the Kingdom of Mali with its capital of Timbuktu, which you probably heard of, but again, probably couldn't place on a map until this moment, and maybe still can't. It's right here. Yeah, that's the one. They're going to take on a lot of that sub-Saharan trade after the Empire of Ghana fell from power. And again, they're also going to be a predominantly Muslim society in order to have religious as well as cultural and economic ties with the wealthy Muslim states along the northern coast of Africa. The most famous Muslim trader and writer is a guy named Ibn Battuta, and so he gives us a number of the accounts here. Quote, "A traveler in this country carries nothing but pieces of salt and glass ornaments, which people call beads, and some sweet-smelling goods. When he comes into a village, the women folk bring out millet, milk, chickens, pulped lotus fruit, rice, and pounded beans. The traveler buys from what he wants of these." And so you can see they had a complex economy with some systems of currency. And copper mining, as we can see here, was incredibly important, and massive wealth came into Mali through these trade networks and the cultivation of these valuable and precious materials. The most famous king of Mali is Mansa Musa, pictured here in this Arabic sort of map. Mansa Musa is famous because he took the Hajj. He traveled from the Kingdom of Mali all the way up to Mecca. And as he traveled through these kingdoms, he did the traditional things that rulers are supposed to do on the Hajj and gave out alms to the poor, distributing massive amounts of wealth. It's said that, quote, "This man Mansa Musa flooded Cairo with his benefactions. He left no court emir nor holder of royal office without the gift of a load of gold. The people of Cairo made incalculable profits out of him and his suite in buying and selling and giving and taking. They exchanged gold until they depressed its value in Egypt and caused its price to fall. This has been the state of affairs for about 12 years until this day by reason of the large amount of gold which they brought into Egypt and spent there." And so Mansa Musa was so unbelievably wealthy that he crashed the whole economy of Egypt for more than a decade on his travel through on his Hajj. So, demonstrates just how spectacularly wealthy the kingdom of Mali was at this point. In the end, Mansa Musa, after his death, his empire collapsed through a combination of infighting and political decline, and in general, the Mansas who followed Mansa Musa were not as capable, and so because of that and the growth of an aggressive militaristic people to the north, Mansa Musa and the Malian Empire collapsed. So, quote, "Raids sapped the strength of the empire on its frontiers, but its decline and fall of Mali was more from the internal decay than from external enemies. The court was frequently torn by fighting among rivals seeking to influence the Mansa while maneuvering to succeed him." And so, court politics brings down many an empire, and that's the case with the Kingdom of Mali. They were replaced with the Kingdom of Songhai, who then took over and controlled the gold and salt trade. They kept on the similar architectural styles, building the mosques in similar styles. Their capital, they maintained the city of Timbuktu. And as you can see here, the Songhai Empire, although it did not stretch out to the coast, controlled the valuable trade routes across the Sahara, bringing in spectacular amounts of wealth. The merchants bringing in this wealth, of course, became incredibly wealthy and powerful, and exerted a lot of pressure and influence. As you can see here, the camel was used as, quote, "the mobile military vehicle of the desert," and the war canoe became the swift means to just dominate the farmers and trading villages. And so for nearly 3 decades, the founder of Songhai, Sunni Ali, waged continuous war amongst the peoples of the middle Niger until he brought the area under his control. So Sunni Ali was the first leader of the Songhai Empire. He developed a large navy, started bringing in modern weaponry, and used a system of local councils to rule, by which it was sort of similar to the way the millet system would have worked in the Ottoman Empire, where he would these local councils could then send representatives to him, and then he would hear their grievances at least in a standard period of time, and theoretically address them. And so by this, he was able to figure out sort of what his people wanted and be able to provide some sort of responsiveness within his governmental system. What started really weakening these African empires, and one of the reasons why Songhai was able to continue for a period of time, even though you had sort of even though they didn't have any coastal areas, is that the Portuguese were beginning to move along these areas. Portugal and Spain had both reconstituted themselves through a process called the Conquista to become 2 of the first sort of modern nation states in Europe. We'll talk about this more in future lectures, but a Portuguese noble named Prince Henry the Navigator set up a patronage network of navigators and explorers, eventually encouraging Portuguese to move down and explore the coast of Africa, establishing trading posts and relationships with the variety of of African states. By this point, Songhai had shrunk pretty significantly, due mostly to raids from sort of northern African peoples, especially in what is modern-day Morocco, who had even more advanced weapons through their trade with the Muslim world and the gunpowder empires. And so as you can see, Morocco came, the Moroccans displaced to some degree the Songhai Empire, and they would fall from power. The arrival of Europeans and other foreigners gave the African tribes a series of interesting challenges to navigate. Do you try to resist these Western incursions, or do you try to cooperate with them in order to get access to valuable trade goods that you probably wouldn't have access to otherwise? The Kingdom of Dehome was one of these African tribes that attempted to balance between trading with European groups versus resisting them. They used a powerful military in order to dominate the tribes next to them, and used harsh punishments in order to keep these groups subservient. As shown in the movie The Woman King, they also had an incredibly powerful all-female military force of elite soldiers that was used in battle to crush their enemies. In order to maintain their status, the Kingdom of Dehome both resisted European trade to some extent, but also participated. especially in the transatlantic slave trade. Because they were a powerful military group, they were able to capture enemy groups or other groups of Africans, and then they could sell them to Europeans in exchange for European manufactured goods, technology, and things like that. Over time, this led to Europeans to view the people in Dehome as, at least to some degree, quote, civilized is the word that Europeans would have chosen to use, although, again, it is somewhat problematic in a whole bunch of different reasons. But at least in their relationship with the English and other European groups, they were viewed as a very advanced African civilization because of their willingness to cooperate with Europeans and their incorporation of some European styles and aesthetics. That brings us to the conclusion, so hopefully you can answer these objectives with some detail, and thank you for listening.